Welcome back. How do you say goodbye to a hero, a man who was in every way a revolutionary figure in our politics and whose famous words, "Let the people decide," became a rallying call in the push for true democracy and electoral justice? Today, Opinion Court pays tribute to a man who shaped modern Kenya like few have, the late Kenneth Matiba. We'll be getting perspective from a one-time presidential candidate and now Kenya leader Martha Karua and Kenya's second longest serving political detainee, Koigi Wawamwere. And in studio, Rose Lukalo Owino. She is a founder trustee of the Media Policy Research Center and was the first editor at KTN in the early 90s and led a team that extensively covered Matiba. Next to her, a very familiar face to our audiences, Mutegi Njao, who is a veteran journalist and was at the time of these historic events, the editor at The Nation. To my immediate right is Wanyiri Kihoro, who is the chairman of Independence currently, but also a former Nyeri Town MP. And next to him, our resident political analyst, Edward Kisiangani. And you're all welcome to the program. Thank you. A hero, an icon has passed on. Rose, what are your memories of him?
Wow. Memories of a very vibrant, straight-talking, charismatic man. Very popular, extensively popular with people from all walks of life and all parts of this country. Particularly should I call them the poor? He really touched them and spoke for them. I remember him being fearless. I remember him being counted wherever there was resistance and always never backing down. I do remember all that of him.
And Muteki, you know, Rose has talked about him being popular with all sorts of, you know, everyday Kenyans, but he was immensely wealthy, but still managed to connect to everyday people.
In fact, Matiba was a very good friend of mine from the beginning until at one time I sued him because he talked.
Yes, you did.
I talked some things which were not true. Anyway, I knew him when he was a very strong person. The first time I talked to him, he was telling me that he was going to resign as a cabinet minister. We were at that home of his in the Murang'a County Embassy. I asked him, "You cannot resign in my government, you will suffer." I told him, first of all, you will be detained. He said, "I am very strong. I just came from climbing Mount Everest. No detention will change me." Then I said, "You'll be denied foreign exchange," because that time foreign exchange was very important. And you know, you're a man of hotels. You will not get foreign exchange for your business. He said, "I have more foreign exchange than the Kenyan government." So, so he was a very strong person. Finally, of course, he did resign, and that's the reason why we are now talking what we are talking. Because had he not resigned and gone to politics of opposition, he still be probably alive.
Yeah, this week you said in a series of tweets that Matiba passed on long before this week. What did you mean by that?
I mean, they killed him because he represented a very special spirit in this country. In the late 80s, it was unimaginable in this country that anybody would challenge Daniel Arap Moi. In fact, nobody would believe you. They would think you are mad. And more so with a guy who was having a cabinet post like Matiba, it was not easy to imagine that he could still challenge the government. And the Mlolongo business, you know, and the fact that the election was a sham, he had a lot of issues, and he would laugh it off and still speak about very serious things. You will think he's joking, but he's making a lot of sense. So in that case, he was a hero to so many people, including myself, as young people who had just left university and now we had started our working life. He inspired us because despite his immense wealth, he was still concerned about the plight of very many Kenyans who are then suffering under one-party dictatorship. And as a result, he lost his ministerial post, was detained and brutally destroyed in prison. The Matiba who was detained is not the one that left the detention.
Earlier, I asked Martha and Koigi how his politics affected their lives. Listen.
I first came into contact when we were rooting for multipartism. We were active as lawyers. I was then a young lawyer. And when he came out with Charles Rubia to call for multipartism, and those were days the culture of fear was very ripe. And any politician speaking out against the government was seen as being suicidal because you were courting death and destruction of your businesses, if any. So people were not talking. In fact, at one time, the Law Society and a few clergymen were like the unofficial opposition. The likes of Timothy Joya, the late Dr. Henry Okulu, the late Archbishop David Gitari. Those were some of the voices that would come out boldly. So for two politicians who had been inside government to come out and call for multipartism, it actually gave a big push and accelerated the pace. And the call to duty for me came when the KANU regime tried to emasculate the Law Society those days. And as young lawyers, we started doing requisitions, asking for a special general meeting, because we wanted to impeach our leadership for leaning too close to the government. That's how, so my politics was born out of the repression of the 90s.
People whom I have believed are on the side of good in life, justice, freedom, and other qualities have always influenced me.
Wanyiri, how did his politics influence you?
I think it was a great influence on me. And interestingly also, when he really decided after the Mlolongo elections in this country, because I think that is when he decided really to part with KANU in 1988. That election had changed Matiba completely, and he had lost hope in change as promoted then by KANU. And I think also that election in 1988 changed Kenya in a big way. When they found very few people, if supported by the administration, they could win the election. The longest queue, they would tell me, is the one that loses. That changed Matiba and changed Kenyans in a big way, that in another 3 years, 4 years, by 1992, we had a multi-party system in this country. So he influenced me in a big way because having that legal background, and thinking every time that our country was about the change of Section 2A of the Kenya Constitution at that time, that if we changed Section 2A, things will be okay. Matiba brought that popular aspect to what we had been saying before. Because I'd been detained before, and our campaign every time looked as if it was marginalized. Matiba came in with gusto, with his strength, with the resources. He could not be ignored by anybody. He could not be ignored by former President Moi. And by 1990, multi-party system in our country was allowed, and it became law. And I think it is unthinkable that today Kenya, the way it is today, 50 million Kenyans would go back to a one-party state.
Rose and Mutegi, I want to ask you about his campaigns, and you've talked about how much gusto they had, the colorful nature of the way the man campaigned. I think at some point going up against Keanu, was it? And, you know, if you would compare and contrast for us the influence of money in politics then and money in politics now, for Wanyiri, very much the fact that he had the resources and could not be ignored led to a good thing in terms of opening up the democratic space. We still see politicians with a lot of money getting into our politics, but it doesn't necessarily have a liberation result, if you like. Talk to me about those campaigns.
I think Matiba, even though he had a lot of property and a lot of money, it's not the kind of fellow who used to go throwing money to people like former President Moi used to do, or the KANU politicians. He would enable people. Like, for instance, in his constituency, he had a company called Wangu Empori, where he empowered his constituents when he became MP. He used to empower people. He is not the kind of fellow, like kind of people that time who would give journalists money. No, 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 no. He didn't do that kind of thing. He was just popular, and people liked him. I remember when he, just before he resigned, he told me, you can't trust Moi, you can't trust Kanu. Moi will greet me like this. When I'm shaking Moi's hand, he's telling Komodo at my back. Komodo was the Moi's person then.
Right.
You will tell Komodo, hate him. Moi is holding your hand, and Komodo is hating you. So that's why he decided now, I must go. I must resign. I can't trust Moi. He must go.
But I think also what Mtegi is pointing to is the role of money was not that prevalent at that time in elections. It really was about the person. And we had this person for the, you know, I mean, there were a few of them, but he was among the top at the time who could actually mobilize people with an idea, around an idea and possibilities of what we can be as human beings, around the possibility of being a society that respects its weakest and provides space for the strongest as well, just around the possibility of greatness of Kenya. And I think that's what a lot of people responded to.
Earlier, Martha Karua told me that at the time, standing up to the then president, Moi, was a death wish. Listen.
They were risking not just their freedom, they were risking their financial base. And you can see it eventually came to pass. His sacrifice saw the destruction of his business empire, saw the destruction of his health. Because when the dawn of multipartyism came in December 1991, Matiba was recuperating in London, having suffered a stroke while in detention. So you can see that even when he came to join other leaders in preparing to participate in the first multi-party election after the repeal of Section 2A, he was not very well. He was still recuperating from that stroke he had. You could see it in his speech, in his walk. But even though he was not completely well, he once again was sacrificing his health and his all in order to lead the Kenyans to victory.
And I said, anybody who showed up opposing Moi, whether you are a journalist, whether you're a university student, whether you're a university lecturer, you have to go. And many people are killed. You remember Makenya and all those, and in February and all those. Many people are detained, many people were killed. So Moi was not,
I spoke
like
to
you said,
Charles Rubia, for instance, earlier this week, and part of what he said to me is that he was surprised that Moi would actually put him behind bars. Reason being, he didn't know him to be that vindictive, and that he still believes that there were certain elements within the state machinery who had personal grudges with certain politicians because they were benefiting from the way in which the state operated, and that they are the ones who really galvanize such positions. So what do you think of that?
No, they couldn't have done that without knowledge or with approval of the president. So it is not possible. You cannot say, for instance, when Oko was killed, Moi did not know. You know, all those people are detained by the system. The courts were Moi courts. Everything was. You could not even. I remember one day he called me. We are writing a story about Mwangale and some corruption he has involved himself. Somehow it leaked to the special branch, and Moi was told, and he called us. Let me tell you, if you wrote something which was Moi was against, first of all, when you wrote that, nation was closed from governing parliament. You will see special branch fellows coming to you and come to take you. Wahuma Mutai was taken when he was sitting behind me. Because, so I don't think it is a machinery without the knowledge or approval of the government or the president himself.
The head of state.
Yeah, and I think we had really, if we look back to those times, there were people, those who gave their allegiance to Moi were given such huge powers. You talk about the late Oyugi, you talk about the late Biwott. I mean, these are people who were feared. They were absolutely feared in Kenya. You didn't want, I mean, I think if you get into a lift with one of them, you freeze because you don't even want to breathe, you know. It might cause you huge and tremendous problems. There are people, I mean, people like Mwashengu wa Mwachofi, who went up against Moi, ended up even with brothers and sisters being victimized. You know, they're victimized because their sisters work in the civil service. And so, I mean, it was like a huge machinery that you just had to be afraid of. And I think you cannot discount the role of the president in creating that machinery. I don't think it was that vicious when he took over. Some people say that he changed after the coup attempt in President Moi changed after the coup attempt in 1982 and became harder, should we say. But at the end of the day, you cannot discount his role
And you
in that.
paid a very personal price whilst you were editor at KTN.
Yeah, I was fired. I was fired the day then Honorable Kibaki
He was then the Minister for Health.
was the Minister for Health, and he called the station and said that he had resigned from government, and I was sent home the same day. It's not something that I talk about a lot because I'm telling you, journalists paid huge prices during that time. They were detained, they were tortured, they can tell you things that police did to them. So I feel sometimes like I got off easily, although
And
it was
why
a
were you
huge
sent
price.
Because you ran the story.
I ran the story. I ran the story as news editor on that particular day. It was a big story. It was a Christmas day, and you know Christmas days are usually dry days. So we were very excited about this story, and we really played it up. But again, at that time, it was a time when the president preferred to fire people if he thought they were going to, you know, turn on him. And so I think in some respects that space was not given to him, and the hand came down on,
In fact,
on me.
You could not resign from Moi's government or Moi's. You don't.
How?
It's true.
You don't resign. That's
Yeah.
you'll
Yeah.
be told stay, but then fired.
Yes.
Stay
Yes.
so I can fire you.
Yes.
Yeah.
You paid your own price.
Yes.
And this week, social media has been awash, you know, with part humor, part speculation as to whether the retired and very much ailing president would say something about Matiba's demise. Does he need to say something? Does his family need to say something?
I think decency, human decency, demands of former President Moi not to speak.
Not to speak.
Not to speak, not to send an apology, not to tell Edith Matiba or the 5 children of the family, Paul, because I agree with my friend that Matiba's death, a man of great health during his first 45 years in the world, who scared all these business, physical challenges, should die now and live, is some of the people who tormented him still living. So I would say that I subscribe to the same idea like everybody again who has spoken about a president in any country. Is very important. Whether you want to excuse him, to say he never did any wrong, there are people who have taken advantage of his being president to do wrong things. That is not on.
Obviously, we do know President Kenyatta did apologize on behalf of the state at the time, was it about a year or 2 years ago? And that part of the implementation of, that was part of the implementation of the TJRC report. And some would argue states act in perpetuity. And so it does not necessarily, it is meaning enough that a sitting head of state would make that apology. Do you think on a personal level that perhaps the Moi family that has a very prominent son right now, of course the Baringo senator, should say something?
I mean, I think it depends what they say, you know? I mean, what we're talking about is very vicious disruption of people's lives, you know? And some lives have never gone back together again. And it must be something that heals. If it's not something that heals, then it is window dressing. It's like icing on a mud cake, you know? Because we cannot just throw away all that has happened, all the lives that have been destroyed. And there are thousands. There are too many to even count, you know? Of course, Honorable Matiba was one of the leading ones, and Honorable Rubia together with him. But when you count all the people who have been through police hands and faced torture, had their businesses destroyed, had their lives torn apart, had their relatives tormented in order to, you know, to force them to behave a certain way, and just even been silenced. I mean, we operating in the newsrooms we behaved as if we were spy masters, you know, that you had to figure out who you talk to, even in the newsroom, because there were spies. You had to figure out what you say when, even at bars, people were arrested. You go for a drink, and the next thing you hear, the person has been detained.
Kama yuko mtu ametukana mimi namsamehe. Na kama yuko mtu ambaye nimesema chochote ambaye kimeumiza roho yake unisamehe.
As you well know, Martha Karua not once but twice walked out on President Moi. Listen to what she had to say of him.
We were doing our best to remove Moi and Kanu from power. But we must also admit that there are some good things Moi did. If I were to be asked what the Moi legacy was, I would say education. He started so many schools. He's the one who started a multiple of universities. We actually laughed that time. We thought it was wrong for him to start without infrastructure. But look at the university population today. If we had waited to build, so many people would have been left out without a good education, both secondary and university. So there are some things, good things he did. Number two, whenever there was resistance and the country was almost coming to boil, Moi would retreat. Like the way he said that he has set a commission to go around the country and talk to people about if they want multipartyism, and he eventually allowed multipartyism. The country would have burst if he had not. The same thing to when he allowed minimum constitutional reforms in 1997. Those are two instances I can say that we were in troubled waters, we were capsizing, he steered the boat.
Finally, there are certain words that we use in our everyday political coverage that we hear politicians trumpet quite thunderously, if you like, especially, I would say, those in the opposition movement when talking about the state of the nation or what it is that they are doing, what their clamor is about. And I would like you both to give, if you like, the benefit of institutional memory so that we really understand what we mean by these words. And I'll give you a word each. So Mutegi, you well know that Nasser led a resistance movement. That's what Miguna is the leader of, if you like.
The general.
The general of, yes. What did resistance mean in that part of the 80s and early 90s, and what has it become today?
Most of it, from Kenyatta time to Moi time, most of it was underground because you could not raise your hand. We would find in the halls of residence some documents which are attacking the government of Kenyatta, and you find them there on the door when you are. So most of it, including groups like February 20 whatever movement, Kenyan group, all those, the resistance that time could not be open because, as I said, opposing openly is suicidal, or you are going to detention. And if you are known, remember Reverend Imunde, He's just under diary, where he had written things which were against the government. In his personal diary, he didn't even say anything. They just arrested him on the road, on the street, and opened the diary and found him that he had written something against the government. And he was put in detention for 6 years. So you could not resist openly. But there was resistance. And people worked hard. Who were caught, were jailed, who were not, survived.
Is resistance different today? And is that, do you think, a testament of us maybe struggling, yes, but a democratic space?
We have some space, not enough. Because if we had enough space, then we would not be around here.
Beyond the program. Rose, courage. What was courage then, and do we have courage now?
I think courage always exists, but I think it was much more on show at that time because the stakes were so much higher. The cost was very evident. I know the stories we had, this group still exists, Release Political Prisoners, which supported the mothers of detainees. And I had a friend in there called Mudhoni, and when they were arrested by police, because they tended to go for the weaker people, the young, and those who are not from really economically empowered families, who won't be, they're not going to fight the police. And these people were, they would be taken into police cells, and you find them pulling out braids one by one from the head, straight out of your head, Wangari Maathai standing up just because to oppose Uhuru Park being taken away from us. She had her whole life put on the front page of papers, a very dirty court case. She was called all manner of names. She was discussed in Parliament, and still she stood, So I think the stakes were much higher, but courage exists even today. I think the problem that we have is that we seem to have been lulled. I think we thought we had made it, and we're just realizing there's more work to be done. So I think we're hearing a few courageous voices, and I'm sure if courage will always exist. Courage will always exist among human beings. There are always courageous people, yes.
Detention without trial.
Yes.
What did that mean then, and do you think it exists today?
Detention in the straightforward way in which it is decided or provided for under the Preservation of Public Security Act 1966, and then also in the Constitution, immediately it does not exist. But there are a lot of detained people mentally, from lack of courage, from that belief that when you stand up to a wrong, when the government is in the wrong, it is you who should actually be silenced. And detention, therefore, without trial, for me, I'm, by the way, almost one of the last persons to switch off the lights in the detention centers in this country. I went to 4 prisons, from Shimolatewa down to Naivasha. And I can tell you immediately, in terms of the law, it is not there. But in terms of the thinking, in terms of the liberation of our people, in terms of resistance to bad governance, now the resistance is still there. Because we can see bad governance. We can see corruption in our communities. We can see people, some people have become more illiterate. In this country, if you look at what we are today, we have got more illiterate people. People who cannot read the paper, people who can only listen, but they cannot even write their names. The other day when I went to the bank, somebody is told, says he wants, given a pen to write, and says he wants to use a rubber stamp or to use a thumbprint. All that is there today. So the resistance movement today is about the economic empowerment of our people.
Finally, Prof, a word we've heard a lot on Opinion Court lately in reference even sometimes to the current President Kenyatta, some claiming that, you know, he's taking a dictatorial path. What was dictatorship at that time?
The dictatorship that we witnessed under the Nyayo administration was extreme intolerance of alternative opinion. And it was hatred for those you don't agree with. Now, in my opinion...
And sometimes even death.
Death was a common denominator for all those who opposed Moi. Today, when you look at our country, I don't think we are at that level of Daniel Arap Moi. Really, only people who probably didn't live under Moi. Most of us who are there as students, we are lucky we are alive. And we are lucky we were not detained without trial. So it won't be very, very good justice to say that in terms of dictatorship, you say that Kenyatta's regime, President Uhuru Kenyatta's regime, has become a Moi regime. We haven't reached there. But there are a couple of things that they need to put right. I think to continue with the constitutional advancement that we have, so that certain things don't degenerate into the actual dictatorship that we had.
Wouldn't do justice ending this program without talking about the role of women in the second liberation movement. You heard a little earlier from Rose's perspective. Listen to what Koigi Wamwere has to say with a very personal account.
Our mothers who came together at Uhuru Park to fight for the freedom of their sons who had been imprisoned and detained for demanding democracy, and especially multi-party democracy. We know that the mothers camped at Uhuru Park for more than 1 year when the government would not cede to their clamor for the release and freedom of their sons. But they did everything they could to get their sons released, even to the point of stripping, in order to express their disgust at the fact that the government wasn't doing anything to release their sons.
But initially when it was hot, Shamala acted for Koigi and I acted for Miroge Karaoke. And I remember a screaming headline on the, was it, I'm calling it Kanu Times. What was the name of the newspaper? Kenya Times. Saying that criminals under the guise of lawyers. They were likening us to criminals for representing the treason trial. We worked as hard as the men, if not harder, but stories of women are always forgotten. Remember, in the struggle for independence, other than very lately after dawn of second multipartyism, nobody was talking of the fact that there was a woman who went to Lacan's house, Priscilla Abwao. We only heard of her much later. Now, I look at the media, especially the print media, when they talk about young Turks, in quotes, the young people who are in the second liberation, you will hardly get my name out there. And I wasn't alone as a woman. There were such people as Beatrice Duta, a fellow lawyer. There was Lydian Wanjira, a fellow lawyer. There was Martha Kome. We were all very, very active. But you will not get mentions of our names. You will get the men. Even in the politics of that day, just the same way I couldn't find space in Fordasili, it's not because they sat and decided we don't want this girl, but the psyche operating in the men's mind at that time was that politics is not for women.
And that's our time. Thank you for your views, and thank you at home for watching. God bless you, and God bless Kenya.